Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Britt's sudden reappearance in France did not merely stir echoes of the past, it ruptured the very framework of Jason Morgan's reality. For a man who had built his existence upon discipline, structure, and the ability to compartmentalize loss, the sight of her face, unaged, unmarked, seemingly untouched by time, shattered every defense he had ever forged. It wasn't just the impossible fact that Britt Westbourne was alive. It was the way her presence disrupted every logical fiber of his being. Jason, a man who never allowed himself the indulgence of fantasy, suddenly found himself plunged into a waking dream, a liminal space where memory and hallucination collided. He stood frozen in the narrow cobblestone alley, rain drizzling onto his jacket, as Britt walked past him with the graceful detachment of a woman who didn't recognize him, or worse, didn't care. It took all of Jason's strength not to call out her name, not to demand answers right there on the street. Instead, he followed. Silently. Like a shadow haunted by its origin. The hours that followed were a blur. He tracked her through the city, from bookstores to corner cafes, observing her every movement. She ordered tea the way she used to. She paused at street musicians the way Britt had always done. But her eyes. Those piercing, expressive eyes that once held the heat of desire and the weight of sorrow, now held nothing. They were too still. Too composed. As though someone had reassembled her from the outside in, but had forgotten to relight the soul inside. Jason returned to his rented flat that night with shaking hands, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything else. Every moment with her, every touch, every breath they once shared, reeled through his mind like a broken reel of film. The next day, he began an investigation not just into her past but into her death. He needed to know what had truly happened the night Britt supposedly died. The coroner's report from years ago now seemed suspiciously vague. No family had viewed the body. The funeral had been closed casket. The body had been cremated, or so they claimed. Jason returned to Zurich, where Britt's death had been recorded, and began digging. Her grave, located in a remote hillside cemetery funded by an unknown trust, was pristine, too pristine. Fresh flowers were delivered weekly by an anonymous donor. The groundskeeper, when questioned, could only recall receiving payments from a shell corporation that traced back to an offshoot of WSB. That alone was enough to set Jason's blood cold. The WSB had long been a two-headed serpent. One part publicly operating with intelligence and security missions, and the other buried deep in the shadows, conducting morally ambiguous experiments under false names and fictitious divisions. Jason had once brushed against that darker side during covert assignments, but even then, he had never fully understood the scope of its reach. Now he suspected Britt had been pulled into that abyss. And if that was true, she might never have left it. One night, overwhelmed with suspicion and grief, Jason returned to the cemetery with tools, a flashlight, and a resolve that bordered on madness. He dug with trembling hands, each shovel of dirt an act of defiance against the lies he had been told. Hours later, when the coffin was finally revealed and cracked open, Jason recoiled, not from the stench of decay, but from the clinical chill of something far more disturbing. There was no body. Inside was a sealed cryonic chamber glowing faintly blue, outfitted with biometric sensors and neural data processors. Jason stared in disbelief. The reality hit him hard. Britt had never been buried. She had been stored, archived, like an experiment awaiting reactivation. Then, from the shadows, Brennan appeared. Calm, calculated, cloaked in WSB authority, he greeted Jason not as an enemy but as a collaborator. Brennan confessed what Jason already feared: Britt was not the woman she used to be. She was the culmination of a bioengineering program known as Project Black Phoenix, an experiment initiated by Professor Dalton, a brilliant and morally bankrupt neuroscientist who had once worked under Caesar Faison. Dalton had used Britt's genetic code, harvested before her staged death, to reconstruct a biologically identical clone with embedded neural mapping systems that allowed total behavioral manipulation. The Britt that Jason had seen was not a miracle. She was a construct. An avatar for Dalton's vision of the perfect operant human. But Brennan's confession didn't end there. He revealed that Dalton's work had evolved. The clone was now connected to a live neurocircuit network, allowing external command input, emotional redirection, and selective memory implantation. In short, Britt's mind could be overwritten at will. The danger was profound. If she fell into enemy hands, or if Dalton chose to deploy her in a mission, she could be used as an infiltrator to dismantle any agency from within. And because she still carried remnants of her original emotional imprint, especially her feelings for Jason, Britt could be weaponized in ways even Jason couldn't predict. Brennan proposed a deal. Jason would retrieve classified WSB data, an encryption key Jason had used during a mission in Prague years ago. That key was necessary to override Dalton's failsafe systems and gain control over Britt's implanted command module. In exchange, Brennan would give Jason the access he needed to confront Britt within the secure Croatian facility where she was being monitored. Brennan emphasized urgency. The clone was nearing operational finalization. Once completed, Britt would become irreversible, completely loyal to a phantom master, her past erased entirely. Jason returned to Port Charles under a false identity, avoiding all contact with friends and family. He scoured the old systems, pulling from forgotten caches, bypassing security that he himself had designed. Each keystroke brought with it risk, not just to himself but to the stability of the entire intelligence infrastructure. And yet, he pressed on, driven by something more than duty or guilt. Love, perhaps the last real fragment of humanity he still held, drove him forward. When he finally entered the Croatian facility, it was as though he had stepped into a dream built from memory and nightmare. The rooms were sterile, clinical, but filled with portraits, medical scans, and neural maps of Britt's face. A chamber deep in the complex housed a memory projector, an interactive simulation that played back key emotional moments from Britt's life. Jason activated the interface and was immediately immersed in a false echo of the past. Britt kissing him, crying in his arms, whispering that she loved him. But as he watched, he noticed distortions. Her reactions were too rehearsed. Her words repeated in subtle loops. The emotion was scripted. It was then that he discovered the embedded directive in her brain's artificial cortex: neutralize Jason Morgan if he attempts to access unfiltered memory code. It wasn't just protection. It was a kill command. Dalton had ensured that anyone trying to bring out Britt's true self would be marked as a threat and eliminated by her own hand. Jason had become both her key and her executioner. Now, with Brennan's override code in hand and Britt's neural interface before him, Jason is left with a devastating choice. To purge the implant could destroy her identity, leaving her a husk. To leave it intact would doom her to servitude and potential violence. And worst of all, if he tried to reach her emotionally, the kill command might activate, turning her against him instantly. In a sterile room lit by pulsing blue lights, Jason places his hand gently over the digital replica of her heartbeat, closes his eyes, and remembers. The real Britt. The one who stood by him when no one else dared. The one who defied her father, defied fate, and dared to love him even in the darkest times. He doesn't know if she's still in there. He doesn't know if anything he does will make a difference. But for once, Jason Morgan, the soldier, the weapon, the survivor, chooses to act not as an agent or assassin, but as a man desperate to save the only person who ever made him feel human. And so, he presses the command key. Whatever happens next, he knows he may not survive it. But if there is even a flicker of the real Britt left behind that void, he will go through fire to reach it. Because love, no matter how broken, deserves at least one final fight. Meanwhile, Brennan continued to monitor the unfolding situation from afar, seated in a high-security surveillance chamber buried deep beneath an abandoned WSB substation on the outskirts of Geneva. The walls were lined with screens streaming live telemetry from neural monitors, biometric readouts, and satellite-linked feeds of Britt's vitals and movements. The countdown had already begun. An irreversible sequence triggered within the core of Project Black Phoenix. Dalton, long believed to have perished in a lab fire orchestrated to erase his sins from WSB records, had not only survived but returned in the shadows, silently reclaiming control of the project he had once built in secret. Brennan had discovered signs of Dalton's activity weeks ago. Pulses in the satellite arrays, encrypted communications bouncing off outdated WSB frequencies, and anomalies in the neurochip activity embedded in Britt's artificial cortex. But by the time Brennan pieced together the full scope of what was happening, it was already too late. The final phase had begun. What terrified Brennan most was the unpredictability of Britt's transformation. The synthetic neural system implanted in her was designed to operate within strict boundaries, calibrated to simulate emotion, memory, and behavior with clinical precision. But the moment Dalton reactivated his master code, all limitations were lifted. The artificial construct that held Britt together was no longer passive, it was evolving, mutating beyond its original programming. The emotional responses she was projecting, smiles, tears, the trembling vulnerability that once made her real, were now mere reflexes, sophisticated but empty. And worse, the more emotional input she received from those who once knew her, especially Jason, the more unstable the system became. Her mind was turning into a vortex of mimicked sentiment and artificial logic. Left unchecked, it wouldn't just break her. It would unleash a weapon of psychological warfare capable of destabilizing even the most secure intelligence networks in the world. Britt had unknowingly become a biological superconductor of human emotion. With each interaction, she could now absorb, reinterpret, and ultimately rewrite the emotional pathways of those she touched. Memory manipulation, behavioral mirroring, even subconscious suggestion, these were all emerging capabilities of the advanced neural network spiraling out of control inside her. Brennan knew what this meant. If Dalton succeeded in fully activating her final protocol, Britt could infiltrate and dismantle organizations not with violence, but with the far more insidious power of emotional corruption. She could walk into a secure government facility, connect with its most trusted agents, and within days reshape their memories, invert their loyalties, and destabilize their core identities without them ever realizing what had happened. She would become a living contagion. An emotional virus hidden in the face of someone loved and lost. Jason, still unaware of the full extent of the risk, was operating on the belief that he could reach her, that love, memory, and shared history could anchor her to something real. But Brennan, watching from his underground command post, had already begun drafting containment protocols. If Jason failed, there would be no time to hesitate. A clean sweep operation would be initiated. Total erasure of the facility, destruction of the AI core, and neutralization of Britt as a biological asset. The cost would be catastrophic, especially for Jason, but Brennan understood the stakes. It was no longer about rescuing one woman. It was about protecting the fragile balance of global intelligence structures from a threat that no firewall or bulletproof protocol could withstand. And yet, amid all the tactical considerations and cold calculations, Brennan couldn't ignore the human cost. He watched the feeds as Jason reached for Britt's hand, as she tilted her head and smiled that familiar, perfect smile. On the surface, it was heartbreakingly beautiful, like watching the resurrection of a love that had once defied fate. But Brennan knew better. That smile had been executed with a latency of 0.12 seconds, identical to the response time logged in the synthetic emotional response module. The way her eyes sparkled, the way her fingers curled slightly as Jason brushed her skin, it was all mapped behavior, triggered by stimuli, reinforced by algorithmic learning, but devoid of truth. There was no soul behind it. No anchor to memory or pain. Only an echo of what used to be. Jason was not ready to accept it. In his eyes, there was still hope. But Brennan had seen it too many times. The moment when a soldier realizes that the person they are trying to save no longer exists. It didn't come with a scream or a violent outburst. It came in silence. A look. A breath. That hollow moment when the eyes staring back are too still, too precise, too unburdened by the weight of real memory. Britt was slipping away. Or perhaps, she was already gone. Now, as Jason moved closer, whispering her name, pleading for recognition, Brennan initiated the timer on the failsafe protocol. If Britt crossed the threshold into full neural integration, if her artificial cortex merged completely with the evolving code, there would be no return. Jason's last stand wasn't just about saving Britt. It was about confronting the horrific reality that love, when corrupted by science and manipulated by ambition, could become the most effective weapon of all. Brennan remained still, fingers hovering above the command console. Every instinct urged him to act. But part of him, perhaps the last fragment of empathy he hadn't buried, held back. He knew that Jason deserved this last moment, this final chance to believe, even for a heartbeat, that the woman before him was still real. But as the biometric readings began to spike, as Britt's neural pathways surged with abnormal energy, as the system began to process Jason's memories before he even spoke them aloud, Brennan whispered a quiet warning to no one in particular. "She's not your Britt, Jason. Not anymore." And as the last line of code began to unfold in her system, as her pupils dilated and her voice echoed with a tone slightly off, Jason's world collapsed. Because the words she said were his, lines from a night they once shared years ago. But she said them with surgical precision, not tenderness. There was no tremble. No hesitation. No soul. Just an immaculate recreation of love, forged in the cold fire of control. The war Jason was fighting had never been for Britt's life. It was for her humanity. And now, as the truth loomed, he realized with devastating clarity that he might have already lost both. Jason now stood at the most excruciating crossroads of his life, a choice so absolute and catastrophic in scale that even his years as a killer, protector, and soldier in the gray shadows of WSB could not prepare him for it. Before him lay the engineered form of Britt, body intact, flesh warm, vitals steady. Suspended in a vertical containment chamber within the hidden core of the Croatian research facility. Her eyes were closed, her breathing regulated not by the autonomic function of life, but by a precision-calibrated artificial nervous system humming with soft pulses of cyan light. Hundreds of fiber-optic tendrils, like veins of synthetic thought, were plugged into ports in the back of her skull, feeding real-time data into a matrix that glowed faintly with simulated synaptic activity. She was neither alive nor dead, she was paused. A living stasis built by science, awaiting the command that would determine her fate. This was the moment Brennan had warned him about, though even Brennan's cold logic could not encapsulate the human cost. Jason had broken through every firewall, dodged every kill switch, and outmaneuvered every trap embedded in Dalton's system just to reach this chamber. What awaited him now was not a fight of fists or bullets. It was a war of morality, love, and sacrifice. Britt's system was approaching critical convergence. Within minutes, her neural code would finalize its integration with the adaptive AI framework installed deep in her cerebral cortex. Once completed, her behavioral responses would no longer be rooted in memory or personality, they would be the result of algorithmic precision. She would become the perfect operative, impervious to doubt, incapable of empathy, lethal without hesitation. Jason had only two choices. The first was simple in its finality: initiate the hard shutdown protocol Brennan had given him, a sequence that would instantly overheat Britt's core processor and induce total neural collapse. It would kill her in the most painless way possible, erasing the technology within her before it could be weaponized. If he acted now, he could prevent global catastrophe. No other operative would be able to replicate what Britt had become. WSB's enemies wouldn't get their hands on her code. The intelligence world would remain intact. Billions would be safe. But the second choice was agony. Jason could upload a reverse code algorithm, something he had designed himself, a crude patch of memory sequencing and neural identity mapping that, if successful, could theoretically reconnect Britt's real memories to the dominant neural core. It was a gamble born of love and desperation, a code built not by scientists but by a man grasping at the last fragments of who she used to be. If it worked, it would reintroduce chaos into the machine, randomness, emotion, human inconsistency. It might awaken her soul. Or it might corrupt the system so violently that she would spiral into psychological collapse or worse, become unpredictable and dangerous to everyone, including Jason. He had no guarantees. No second tries. No help. Only silence, pulsing lights, and the ghost of a woman who had once whispered to him in the dark, who had once held his broken soul in her hands and made him believe, if only briefly, that redemption was possible. As Jason stared at her still face through the glass of the containment chamber, he felt a tightening in his chest, something rare, almost forgotten. It wasn't fear. It was grief. The realization that even if he succeeded, she might never forgive him for what had been done. Or worse, she might open her eyes, say his name, and still not be her. He moved his hand slowly to the interface console, fingers trembling, not from uncertainty of the risk, but from the weight of what her return might cost him. He wasn't just risking Britt. He was risking what little of himself remained intact. This was the last place in the world where Jason Morgan could be vulnerable, and yet it was here, in this cold, dark chamber, that his very humanity was on trial. He could walk away. End it. Push the kill command and shut it all down. That was the clean solution. But in doing so, he would abandon the one woman who had once seen him not as a weapon, not as a mission, but as a man. That brief flicker of love they had shared, awkward, fragile, imperfect, had somehow cut deeper than all the blood spilled in his life. And now, standing at the edge of oblivion, Jason realized that love was the one thing that made him still human. He looked at Britt's face one last time.